In this video, we're going to cover the fundamentals of vibe coding. The vibe coding tool that we will be using in this video is called Cursor. Cursor is a tool that caters to people with some level of a coding background or to people that have a solid understanding of how a particular type of software application development works, as you can simply delegate coding tasks to the Cursor agent, as you'll soon see. If you're brand new to coding, you might find this video a little bit challenging at parts, but you're more than welcome to stay. You're definitely going to learn a ton. And if you're persistent, you definitely can get through it. And in case ultimately you do find Cursor a bit overwhelming, I suggest that you look into Replit or Lovable as next steps in your vibe coding journey. Replit and Lovable are hosted platforms, so they come out of the box with a little bit more setup for you, and you won't have to set up anything on your computer. Cursor will require a couple of setup steps, and depending on exactly what you're trying to develop, you'll need some additional knowledge of what to do. Vibe coding is employing the use of AI coding agents to develop software via natural language inputs. This is in contrast to traditional software development, whereby engineers outline in formal programming languages, line by line or chunk by chunk, each piece of software in an application. Because natural languages like English and Spanish are more widely understood and spoken compared to formal programming languages, vibe coding is enabling people with little to sometimes even no skill in formal programming to be able to program computers and build applications. Long story short, vibe coding is generally considered to not be secure. Why? Because vibe coding in its current form typically exposes application code to third parties, oftentimes big tech, and will often incorporate unaudited third-party code into an application's code base, which once again is considered to not be secure. Additionally, due to human laziness, the coding agents that are used when doing vibe coding, like the ones offered by Cursor, are oftentimes put into what's called YOLO mode, which is a way of giving the coding agent full reign over your computer to do whatever it wants. This can result in the unwanted deletion of files.
Hopefully you took a backup.
The installation of undesired software.
Hopefully no malware included.
And the unwanted transmission of files across the network, for example.
Hopefully no sensitive information was leaked.
Downloading and installing Cursor is super easy. All you have to do is come over to cursor.com, and this button should automatically detect your operating system and present you an option for downloading the appropriate version of Cursor for your machine. I'll click that. And if for some reason the version of Cursor is not right, you can come over to all downloads and select the appropriate one. Once that is finished downloading, you can pop open your downloads folder, unzip the downloaded DMG file, and drag the cursor.app icon into your applications folder. I should say that I'm showing you how to do this on my Mac, but the general flow of how this works should be the same for Linux and Windows. Now that we have Cursor downloaded, we can open it just like we would open any other application on our computer. Cursor does come with a 2-week free trial, so you can give it a spin at no cost, but afterwards you'll likely have to dish out $20 to continue using it. And this is what you're presented with when you first open the app, or something close to this. And the way that you stay organized with your work is by folders. So you want to create a folder on your computer, and that folder is going to hold the code for one application that you're going to develop. You can put multiple folders within that folder and have an application sitting inside each of those subfolders if you want. But typically what you'll see is each folder that you open will represent one application. So I created a folder at this location on my machine called Vibe Coding, and I can open it like so. Navigate to it, and then open it. And now we are inside of the Cursor application. The UI is pretty minimal out of the box, but if you look closely, there are some subtle features to it that you'll learn about over time. But anyhow, the exact way that you're going to be using Cursor will depend on what you're trying to build and how you're trying to build it. That will make sense shortly. But let me give you a quick demonstration as to how someone might use this in the context of web application. If you enter the keystroke Command I, that might be a little bit different on Windows or Linux, and it should be similar though. But anyhow, Command I will open up this side chat panel that by default comes in agent mode. And you can switch the chat panel to be in ask mode or manual mode. And they have these little hints here that explain what each one does. Manual mode is a little bit more advanced. It's not complicated, but pretty much what you're doing in manual mode is you're hand-picking exactly which files are getting sent to the AI along with your prompt. Ask mode allows the cursor agent or the AI to examine your code base and answer questions that you might have about it. But when the chat panel is in ask mode, the cursor agent is not going to propose edits to you based on your prompts. If you put the chat panel into agent mode, when you prompt cursor's agent, it might, depending on your prompt, propose edits to your code base that you can then review. And if you accept those edits, they will then be applied to your code base. You can also upload images, right? Because a lot of these LLMs that are under the hood of these agents nowadays can process images as well as text. And here is where you can select the exact model that is powering your agent. The most popular that I've seen is some variation of Claude by Anthropic, but you're free to choose others. And the last thing that I'll show before we move on is how you can put Cursor's agent into what's informally known as YOLO mode. So if you come over to Cursor's settings and come over to the features sub-tab or sub-panel, you can scroll down and you'll see this feature that used to be called YOLO mode, but they've rebranded it to now be called auto run mode. If you toggle this on, when you prompt Cursor's agent and the Cursor agent determines that some edits to your code base are needed, the Cursor agent will go ahead and apply them without your review. I don't recommend you do this just on principle, but in practice, I've seen this is quite popular of a feature at times. It's sort of a Pandora's box type thing if this were to be adopted at scale, but definitely recommend that you review all of the code that's being proposed to you by whatever LLM you're using. Alrighty, let's get into some vibe coding. Here is the prompt that I'm going to send to the Cursor agent. This is not the most practical thing to ask the Cursor agent to do, but we're starting with a simple example. And by the way, make sure the chat panel is in agent mode. Here's the prompt. Build a file server with JavaScript and the Express framework. If this sounds like gobbledygook to you, or if you're not as familiar with web application development as I'm assuming, what I'm asking for here is I'd like the Cursor agent to build a system similar to Dropbox or Google Drive, for example. A file server is a system that you can upload files to and then access those files over the internet. And I'm asking the Cursor agent to build this little file server application with a programming language called JavaScript. You're typically going to want to ask these coding agents to use some open source and popular programming language because that's more likely what they were trained on. It would be nice if these big tech companies behind these LLMs told us exactly what they used for training their models, but I'm assuming that they're likely training them on, once again, open source and popular programming languages. So you're probably going to want to ask these coding agents to code in JavaScript and Python most of the time. It depends on what you're trying to build, as certain programming languages are more specialized in building certain types of things. But anyhow, hopefully you get the mental model of how at least I think about this. And within a particular programming language, you have what are called libraries and frameworks. Libraries and frameworks are collections of code that you can reuse for free if you're using some open source programming language, like, for example, JavaScript or Python. And these libraries and frameworks allow you to inherit code without having to develop it yourself. It prevents you, long story short, from having to reinvent the wheel. Let me give you an example. So let's say that you were building a website and you wanted to support people being able to log in with their email and password, and also perhaps being able to log in with their Google account or their Microsoft account, etc. You could develop all of that code yourself, or you could find, hopefully, some pre-existing library or framework that has all of that code developed for you and simply copy it into your code base. And things hopefully will work. And there's a lot of benefits to doing things this way. But anyhow, what I'm asking for here is I'd like the coding agent to build a file server with JavaScript and use within JavaScript the Express framework. But long story short is I know Express has a lot of code for building a file server in it. I've done it many times. And that's why I said at the top of the video that these tools are going to be catered towards people who have some sort of coding background or at least a solid understanding of how software works, because you could prompt your way and figure it out. I mean, I'm sure there's very talented prompt engineers who have no coding background and they're able to get amazing outputs. But I would imagine that having knowledge of generally how software works and what libraries are best for which types of things is going to be useful when you're asking the coding agents to build stuff for you. So anyhow, let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so I should have said before that in addition to proposing code changes, the cursor agent can also propose code that should be executed on your machine. And here we're seeing the first instance of that, right? So here the cursor agent is saying, well, I need to run this command to create this folder. And here is where you can accept it or reject it if you want to skip over it. So I'll accept this. That looks harmless. Just creating a folder, right? Okay, so now I can see the agent is doing something that I don't want it to do. It's creating a folder, and then within this folder, it's creating the file server. So I'd like the file server to be created in this vibe coding folder. So what I'll do is stop the agent, and then I'll say build the file server in the current folder. And now it's doing what I wanted to do. Here it's asking me to install some third-party libraries from the Node ecosystem. Here it's creating another uploads folder. We created this one from before, which I think I can delete. And this is the code for the file server. It's creating code that allows me to upload files and read files and delete files. And it's also building a little front end for me as well, it looks like. And then it's creating documentation. And now it's asking me if I want to run this. And now the file server is running on this URL. And here we are. So pretty incredible, right? So welcome to Vibe Coding, and let's move on. Git is a software that will track every edit that is made to every file and every subfolder of a particular code base. Every time an edit is made, Git will track what was changed, who made the change, when it was changed, and why the change was made. When building applications using vibe coding techniques, you're going to be adding a lot of code to your code base in a very short period of time, which can result in bugs being added to your code that you're not even aware of, or it can result in your application completely breaking, meaning it won't even run at all anymore. When this happens, it's very handy to have had Git installed into your code base so that you can see the history of edits and pinpoint where things went wrong, or roll back to a point where things were working and then redevelop from that point again. Even though you might have never heard of it, Git is an extremely popular software and it might already be installed on your computer. If you pop open a shell or terminal on your machine, you can ask your operating system if it's been installed like so. You simply have to type git-v, and if it prints out a version, then that'll indicate to you that Git's already been installed. If you get something like command unknown or command not found, then you will need to install Git. If you're on a Mac, you can use this tool called Homebrew that comes with your OS. There's going to be a corresponding tool for Linux or Windows. For example, there might be a tool called apt-get for your Linux system. Depends on what type of Linux version you're using. Or if you're on Windows, I think it's called Choco. Anyhow, you can install Git on Mac by typing brew install Git. I've already installed Git, so I'm not going to run this. And you can also download Git from this website, git-scm.com, and it should walk you through an installer that'll set things up for you. Anyhow, once you have Git set up, you can verify it's working by popping open a terminal and typing git-v. Once you have that set up, you can move on. Here we are back in Cursor, and we're going to set up our project to be tracked using Git. There are a couple of ways that you can do this. For example, this pane in Cursor comes with a few buttons that you can click to quickly set it up, but I don't like the way Git is set up using this approach. I prefer to set it up myself on the command line or the terminal. So I'll show you the way that I like to do it. And if we come over to the view menu within the taskbar, there's an option that you can select that will pop open a terminal. And you can also pop this open using a keyboard shortcut, control backtick. Anyhow, the way that you add Git to your project is by entering Git init. And you can see things light up within the cursor UI after this is set up. And now let me give a demonstration of what this allows you to do. So if we pop open the cursor chat panel, let's first save our changes. So once again, I mentioned that cursor is a very codery tool. So this is probably going to seem a little bit foreign if you've never seen this before, but it's not that complicated. What I'm doing here is looking at all of the files that have been changed since the last time Git started tracking, and we haven't tracked anything yet. So everything is new. And some of these files are not needed for tracking purposes. This is a little bit technical, but anyhow, when you're developing code, you don't need to store or track every single file. Some files are, for technical reasons, not needed for tracking purposes. So what I'm going to do is remove this one. And then what we're going to do is ignore certain files from being tracked. And the way that we do that is by adding another file to our project called git ignore. And in here, we can list the files that we want to leave out from being tracked. So the main file we want to add here is node modules. This is a folder where third-party code is downloaded, third-party packages or libraries. We don't need to track changes to this code because we're not going to be changing it. That's the responsibility of third parties to change and update that code. We just download it and we don't need to track edits to it. It's not necessary. So anyhow, this is going to be our initial state of our application. And the way that we save this in Git, this is again going to seem a little bit foreign if you've never seen it, but all we're doing here is taking a snapshot of the current state of our application. So what I'm going to type is git add, and I want to add all files into this commit, as it's so called. A commit is a snapshot of our project. And then after I've added all of those files, I can add a message to this snapshot by typing gc-m. And then here I'll put a message that says initial commit, right? And now if I type git log, we can start to see the history of our code being tracked by Git. So now what we'll do is run our application again, npm run start. There we go. And if we pop this open, here's our user interface for our file server. Let's come over to the cursor agent and vibe code some more changes. So what we'll say is, please make the UI cooler. And let's see what happens. Here you can see the cursor agent is looking at all the files and it's trying to discern which files are related to the user interface. And it has correctly identified the index.html file as the file where the current UI code is sitting. It's thinking through some changes that it needs to make. And we should see a diff, which is a view that allows us to see what code is being added and edited by the agent shortly. Okay. Perfect. So let's rerun our application. And yeah, that looks a little bit cooler, I'd say, a little bit more modern. And what we can do is come back, and if we come over to this pane now, we can see all the files that were changed, and we can have AI write the commit message for us by clicking this button here. Right? This gives us a nice description of what was changed. So if we have to look back at the history, we understand what happened and how this application developed. And we can save all of these files into a commit. It's asking us if we want to add all of the files that were changed or only a subset of the files. The way that we add a subset of the files is by hand-picking them with this plus icon. Click yes. And there we go. So I'll stop the development server. Then let's enter git log. And now you can see we have a new entry in our history, right? In our development history. And we can use this to track how things are evolving. And if things break, we can have a better idea of where they broke. And if we start vibe coding and things go completely off the rails, we can roll back to a point where they were working, etc. So Git is a necessary fundamental for vibe coding, I'd say. Definitely, you're going to have to learn Git and master Git. If you'd like to master the fundamentals of Git, I have another video on the channel, which is amazing. It's based on a book called Pro Git by Scott Chacon. He was an engineer that worked for many years at GitHub. Here we are in a brand new, fresh cursor project with nothing inside of it. And over the next few scenes, we're going to be building out a website using vibe coding techniques. The first thing that we're going to take a look at before we jump into vibe coding is this thing called cursor rules. Cursor rules probably sounds a little bit fancy, but it's simple. All that it is a way of flavoring the cursor code generating agent to better or more likely produce the type of code that we're aiming for. Let me give you a demonstration. So if we come over to this site right here, cursor.directory, and then come over to the rules section, here we can find a bunch of example cursor rule files. And on the left here, each cursor rule file is categorized based on the type of development it's related to. So let's say, for example, that our goal was to build maybe a Chrome extension. So what we could do is copy this cursor rule file into our cursor project, and Cursor's internal system would detect that we added this and incorporate all of these guidelines that are theoretically related to producing higher quality Chrome extensions. Because we're building a website, let's add a cursor rule related to Next.js. Next.js is one of the most popular website development or web application development frameworks on the market right now. I read through each of these example cursor rule files, and the one that I liked the most, aka the one that is most aligned to what I'm trying to accomplish, is this one. The way that we add this into our project is at the root, we have to add a folder called .cursor. And then within this .cursor folder, we have to add another folder called rules. And then within this rules folder, we add a file that can be called whatever we want. I'll call it my custom rules. And the extension for this file will be .mdc. And then we paste in the cursor rules that we want to use. Save. Now we're good to go. By the way, there's nothing special about this cursor rules file. All it is natural language in Markdown format. Markdown is a specific way of formatting text in a document. Let's move on. Alrighty, so let's get to some vibe coding. And let's pop open the chat panel, Command I. And what we're going to be doing is building a website, but not just any website. We are going to be rebuilding the Command Labs company website. What I've generally seen in my experience be most effective is you want to start with a solid foundation or boilerplate, and then incrementally vibe code your way to your final destination. So the way that we incorporate the cursor rules into the prompt is like so. We type the @ symbol, and then this allows us to handpick pieces of context for addition into the prompt. We can configure the cursor rules to be included into every prompt by specifying this always option. But Anyhow, we'll go with this approach for now. So we'll select the cursor rules that we outlined and say, please build the boilerplate for an incredible web app that will eventually act as the website for a AI automation agency called Command Labs. Pause after creating the solid boilerplate. Now let's see what happens. Okay, so it's saying we're going to build a project using the Create Next app CLI. Let's see what happens. And it ran into an error because there's an existing folder in this project. This CLI tool expects an empty folder, but there's a hack where it'll create a project in a subfolder and then move all the files back into the current folder. That's what's happening here. And here is a little menu that we have to provide some answers to the CLI through. It's now generating the project folder. I'm going to skip this because it's going to install a bunch of packages. And I'll say move the Next.js app into the current folder. I want everything here, not nested down one folder level. Perfect. Now it's installing all of those packages where I want them. Okay, moment of truth. Let's say run the application. Okay, well, we have some sort of starting point. So let's save this and then continue. Let's lock this stuff in by making a git commit. So if this seems foreign, all we're doing here is saving the current snapshot of our project. And in Git lingo, a snapshot is a commit. Now that we have that saved, beautiful. Let's continue on and make this look a little bit more impressive. So the first thing I'll do is ask the agent to make this mobile responsive. So we have an error here. I'm going to copy it. All right, that's looking a little bit better, but this is not centered for some reason. Let's add a screenshot of the landing page and say, please center the content. It is skewed left. There we go. Make the nav a mobile responsive drawer. And let's wrap this up because I think you get the point. The days of having to code everything yourself, those days are over. Sometimes that will be the right approach because the AI sometimes is not as efficient as you would think or hope. And it definitely helps to have coding skills. But anyhow, let's say scaffold out dummy content for the about services, case studies, and contact pages. I think the last thing we'll do is update the color palette. Hopefully this works. All right. It could be better, but in the name of respecting time, I'll leave it there. I definitely will be tweaking this some more, but for now, I'm pretty happy where this is at. So let's take another snapshot of the application, and we can also do this via this pane right here. And here's a fun little trick. You can click this button to have AI generate a commit message for you. And let's take that snapshot. Bingo. Perfect. We have been storing these Git snapshots or commits of our application on our computer. But let's say that we wanted to store a copy of them somewhere in the cloud for backup purposes. Or let's say that we wanted to store a copy of them so that we could collaborate on building up this code base with other team members. That is where hosted Git platforms come into the picture. There are many options and platforms that we could choose for our hosted Git provider, but for now, we're going to go with GitHub. Let's now walk through how to connect our machine or computer, or authenticate rather, our machine or our computer with GitHub. This is the website that I usually follow along with. If I have trouble remembering these exact commands, I'm going to link this in the description of this video. You pretty much just have to walk down this list of instructions. And if this doesn't work on your machine, you might have to do some Googling or some chat GPTing to figure it out, but it's not that bad. Anyhow, this is the first command that we enter, and this is all terminal related stuff. So here I am using the terminal that's integrated with Cursor, and this is the first command that we'll enter. Here you can put a comment, and I'll say my key for GitHub. Usually what you'll see here is people will put their email. Anyways, this is just a comment. I think it's optional. Anyhow, I'll click enter. This is going to generate a quote unquote password or SSH key that's going to get stored on your computer. And this is where by default it's going to get stored too. If you want to store it somewhere else, you just have to write the path to where you want it to be stored here. But I'll just go with the defaults. And I did not provide a password, so this one is also empty. And if you see something like this, then you did everything correct. The next thing that we do is run the quote unquote SSH agent. And this is a way of integrating this SSH key or password that we just created into our OS so that every time we try to connect with GitHub, our OS will pick up this SSH key and do all the authentication stuff in the background so we don't have to worry about it. And next up, we have to add a little configuration to the SSH setup on our machine. SSH, by the way, is a pretty standard protocol. All of this SSH tooling predates GitHub. Let me delete this. And then here is the entry that we're going to add. So whenever we try to make a SSH connection to GitHub, use the SSH key that we just created. And it says here, if you chose not to add a passphrase, you should omit the use keychain line. Okay. So it says we can omit this, and let's save that. And we have to enter this, and I don't think we need this. Yeah. So if you see something that says identity added, that means everything is looking good. And the final step of this connecting or authenticating with GitHub process is this. And what we have to do is copy the public key of the SSH key that we just created. So an SSH key has two parts. It has a public and a private component. And the way I look at this is the public key is like the ID of you on a particular system or within a particular authentication protocol. And the way that you prove that you are that ID is by providing the password that's associated with that ID. Excuse me if that's a little bit abstract, but to give you another analogy, it's like your email and password when you log into systems, right? You provide your email, that's like your ID on the system. And the way that you prove you are that ID or that identity is by providing the password. Anyhow, this command will copy the public key of the SSH key that we just created. And if we come over to GitHub, so if we come into GitHub proper, and we do have to have an account, if we come into our settings and then come over to this SSH and GPG keys section. I'll create a new SSH key and call this one vibe coding. Then I'll paste in the public key that we copied. Add that. And yeah, I have to do a multi-factor Humblaga thing. Let me take care of this and pause the video. You can now see we have an SSH key registered. So now we are connected or authenticated with GitHub. And what we're going to do is create a new repository, which, long story short, is a place where we can store snapshots. And I'm going to call this repository vibe coding website. I'll make this public for now to keep this simple, but you can make this repository private, meaning that you'll whitelist whoever has access to it. And you can leave all this default, create a repository. And because we already have some snapshots on our machine, this is the next sequence of commands that we need to run. If you were starting from scratch with no repository or snapshots on our local, then we would run these. If you harken back, you'll recognize some of these instructions. Anyhow, these are the ones that we need. This first command creates what's called a remote on our local repository. So we're storing snapshots of our application on our machine, and we can have multiple remotes where we can store backups or copies of these local snapshots. And we can call the remote whatever we want. Here, by default, it's called origin, but we could have called this best remote ever, whatever we want, right? So anyhow, let's just stick with the defaults. The next command is this one, which creates what's called a branch. If we look at our git log, which is the history of the snapshots that we've taken, each snapshot gets this really long ID that's hard to remember. So what we can do is create an alias for one of these IDs, and that alias is called a branch. So you can see here, the last snapshot or commit that we've taken is also called main. Anyhow, let's now run this. And if this works, we should see a copy of all of our code here when we refresh. Fingers crossed this works the first time. And we got lucky. So if we come here and refresh, you can now see we have a copy of all of our code. Now let's show you a little trick for how you can deploy this Next.js web application that's sitting in this GitHub repository. Next.js is a framework that was created and is currently maintained by a company called Vercel. And Vercel has a very easy to use integration with GitHub that allows us to very easily deploy standard Next.js applications. So in order to use this trick, you're going to need to create an account on vercel.com, which I've already done. And what I can do is import a repo from some Git provider. And I have to add the repository that we just created. And I like to give minimal permissions when I'm integrating platforms with each other on principle. So let's pick that exact repo that we just created and give Vercel the ability to read all of the code inside of it. And now we can import this code into Vercel. And let's leave all of this default and deploy our application. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. Let's see how it goes. It looks like it's working. So here we have our website running on a server hosted by Vercel. The last thing that we're going to do is map this deployment of our application to a custom domain, because when you're making a website, you want to give people a nice branded domain name. So you can use that to get business and whatnot, right? And build your name. So let's set that up, and that's going to be it for this video. Here we are in the project on Vercel for the Next.js web application that we've been developing. And if we come over to the settings, there's a tab called domains, and we can add a domain here. And the one that we're going to go with is cmdlabs.io. Let's add that and click save. And we now have to configure our DNS. So when you're purchasing a custom domain, you have to go to a registrar. And there are many registrars out there. For example, GoDaddy. There's another one called Namecheap. The one that I use to acquire cmdlabs.io is called Route 53. It's owned by Amazon. Here are all of the settings that I've currently configured for this domain name. And this is the one that we need to update, this A record, right? So the name has to be @ and the value has to be this. And then let's save that A record, right? And we also have to add a CNAME record. Let's create a record. This is going to be a CNAME record. The name will be www as indicated here. And the value will be cname.vercel-dns.com . And let's create that. I'll indicate that I've added this. It says there's an issue. Let me try removing this @ symbol. Wondering if that's the issue. Did that work? Yes. So here you can see now when I visit cmdlabs.io, it redirects to www.cmdlabs.io and it loads the web application that's being hosted in Vercel. Welcome to Vibe Coding. Definitely aspects of what we are showing here represent what software is going to look like. The days of having to tell or ask or have humans code every line of an application, I think the reality is those days are over. So plan accordingly.